What if I told you that the greatest military disaster in Roman history, the Battle of Cannae, wasn't just a story of brilliant tactics? Yes, we all know the textbook account. Hannibal, with an army nearly half the size of Rome's, executed a masterful maneuver, surrounding and utterly annihilating 8 Roman legions. But what if that canonical version is merely a smokescreen, obscuring the true, far more sophisticated and chilling cause of the catastrophe? This isn't a military history lesson. This is an autopsy report on the most ambitious murder in human history, where the victim wasn't just an army, but the very soul of the Roman Republic. I invite you to become detectives and, together with me, crack the code of Cannae. We'll follow a trail laid down 2,000 years ago to understand how a battle that couldn't be won was, in fact, won. Let's close our eyes for a moment and transport ourselves to August of 216 BCE, to the Roman encampment by the Aufidus River. Try to truly feel this world. The air here isn't merely hot, it's thick, heavy, saturated with the odors of 80,000 men and thousands of animals penned on a small patch of scorched Apulian earth. It's a pungent cocktail of sweat, fear, cheap sour wine, which the soldiers used to dilute murky water, and the smoke from countless fires where flat barley bread sizzled. To this, add the scent of superheated metal, oiled leather, and the blood of sacrificial bulls, which priests slaughtered every morning, striving to discern the will of the gods in their entrails. It's the reek of a colossal, twitching war machine poised for action. Now listen closely. It's not silence. It's the low, incessant hum of a vast human mass. It's comprised of thousands of sounds: the methodical rasp of whetstones against gladius blades, the muffled thuds of hammers on shields and helmets in makeshift forges, the whinnying of thousands of horses irritated by the heat and flies, and the guttural chatter in dozens of Italic dialects. Legionaries from every corner of the Republic argue, laugh, and play dice, yet a palpable tension underlies every voice. Above it all echoes the sharp, whip-crack voice of a centurion conducting another drill. This isn't an army in the modern sense. It's an entire city under arms, humming like a disturbed beehive, sensing the approach of a foreign, lethal force. To understand what happens next, we must crack 3 codes, 3 programs hardwired into the consciousness of every Roman, from senator to common legionary. The first code, Dignitas. This wasn't merely dignity or honor. It was social standing, reputation, political clout. For a Roman aristocrat, losing dignitas was worse than death. Their entire lives were a frantic race to accumulate dignitas, and the best fuel for this pursuit was a resounding military victory. It was this insatiable hunger to amplify his dignitas that drove Consul Varro to take reckless risks. The second code, virtus. Initially, this word meant courage, valor, but for the Romans, it became synonymous with the entire constellation of civic and military virtues. Virtus was what made a Roman a Roman. It was an almost religious conviction that their discipline, resilience, and disdain for death elevated them above any other people. They didn't merely believe they could defeat Hannibal. They felt, by the laws of the cosmos, they were bound to do so. Any other outcome seemed unnatural, a glitch in the system. This unwavering belief in their own superiority would prove to be their Achilles' heel. And finally, the third, most deeply ingrained code, mos Maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. This was Rome's unwritten constitution, a compendium of traditions and rules, sacred and inviolable. Romans believed their strength lay in adhering to the paths laid down by their founders. They knew how to wage war, deploy the legions in the field, meet the enemy head-on, and crush them with sheer force and valor. They simply couldn't fathom that an enemy might play by entirely different rules, one who would employ cunning, deception, and a mastery of psychology, turning Roman might itself into the instrument of its own destruction. Now, imagine this. The Roman Republic at this moment isn't just a state. It's a colossal corporation whose stock, its reputation and influence in the world is under threat. It faces a hostile takeover orchestrated by a brilliant corporate raider named Hannibal. At the helm of this corporation are two co-CEOs with veto power, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro, an aggressive manager and populist, promises shareholders, the Roman people, quick, stunning returns, one decisive battle that will grind the enemy to dust. Paulus, a cautious aristocrat and old-school board member, understands that the adversary is playing the long game and requires an entirely different strategy. But the corporate governance system was such that they commanded in alternating shifts, each revoking the other's orders daily. And Hannibal, that genius of hostile takeovers, had thoroughly studied their internal reports, their ambitions, their fears, their pride. He knew he didn't need to storm the fortress. He simply needed to await the day when the most vain of the directors was at the helm. The true starting point for the tragedy of Cannae wasn't the clang of weapons, but a deafening silence. Silence on the battlefields. For 2 years, Hannibal had been in Italy. For 2 years, like a ghost, he had glided through the very heart of the Republic, burning farms and annihilating small detachments. Rome had adopted the only correct, but politically unbearable, tactic of Quintus Fabius Maximus, dubbed Cunctator, the delayer. Fabius avoided a decisive engagement, exhausting the Carthaginian army through guerrilla warfare. But for the Roman people, accustomed to victories, this wasn't a strategy, it was a national humiliation. Each day without battle was another scar on the Republic's pride. The air in Rome was crackling with anger, and that anger sought an outlet. It found one in the person of Gaius Terentius Varro. Varro wasn't a hereditary aristocrat. He was a self-made man, the son of a butcher, who had achieved a meteoric career based on a single idea, which he, as a skilled demagogue, tirelessly broadcast to the crowd. Enough with hiding. He said what everyone wanted to hear, that Fabius was a coward, that Romans shouldn't run from the enemy on their own soil, that one powerful, decisive strike would end the Carthaginian threat forever. His election as consul was a political earthquake. It was a mandate from the people not to wage war, but to bring it to an immediate and triumphant conclusion. The engine of history, which Varro revved to full power, was an idea as simple as a hammer blow and monstrous in its essence. If Hannibal was so strong in tactics, then Rome needed to create an army against which all tactics would be useless. An army that would win, not with intellect, but with brute force. Rome decided to field the largest army ever assembled under the Republic's banners, 8 legions, reinforced by allied contingents. By various estimates, this amounted to between 80 and 90,000 men. This wasn't just an army, it was a living battering ram, a mathematical argument against genius. The idea was simply to crush the Carthaginian formation into the ground, to grind it down with overwhelming numerical superiority. For its time, this was something unimaginable. Such an army, arrayed on a field, represented a colossal wall of humanity and steel, dozens of ranks deep and several miles wide. It was an entire city that had marched to war. The logistics of this monster were a nightmare, command and control practically impossible. But therein lay the audacity of Varro's plan. Command wasn't needed. Only one thing was required, to advance and kill until the enemy was gone. This was the quintessence of the Roman spirit of virtus, pushed to its absolute limit, to an absurd, blind faith in its own power. And now, picture this. The Roman Republic at this moment isn't just a state, it's a colossal corporation whose stock, its reputation and influence in the world is under threat. It faces a hostile takeover orchestrated by a brilliant corporate raider named Hannibal. At the helm of this corporation are 2 co-CEOs with veto power, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro, an aggressive manager and populist, promises shareholders, the Roman people, quick, stunning returns, one decisive battle that will grind the enemy to dust. Paulus, a cautious aristocrat and old-school board member, understands that the adversary is playing the long game and requires an entirely different strategy. But the corporate governance system was such that they commanded in alternating shifts, each revoking the other's orders daily. And Hannibal, that genius of hostile takeovers, had thoroughly studied their internal reports, their ambitions, their fears, their pride. He knew he didn't need to storm the fortress. He simply needed to await the day when the most vain of the directors was at the helm. The true starting point for the tragedy of Cannae wasn't the clang of weapons, but a deafening silence. Silence on the battlefields. For 2 years, Hannibal had been in Italy. For 2 years, like a ghost, he had glided through the very heart of the Republic, burning farms and annihilating small detachments. Rome had adopted the only correct but politically unbearable tactic of Quintus Fabius Maximus, dubbed Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabius avoided a decisive engagement, exhausting the Carthaginian army through guerrilla warfare. But for the Roman people, accustomed to victories, this wasn't a strategy, it was a national humiliation. Each day without battle was another scar on the Republic's pride. The air in Rome was crackling with anger, and that anger sought an outlet. It found one in the person of Gaius Terentius Varro. Varro wasn't a hereditary aristocrat. He was a self-made man, the son of a butcher, who had achieved a meteoric career based on a single idea, which he, as a skilled demagogue, tirelessly broadcast to the crowd. Enough with hiding. He said what everyone wanted to hear, that Fabius was a coward, that Romans shouldn't run from the enemy on their own soil, that one powerful, decisive strike would end the Carthaginian threat forever. His election as consul was a political earthquake. It was a mandate from the people not to wage war, but to bring it to an immediate and triumphant conclusion. The engine of history, which Varro revved to full power, was an idea as simple as a hammer blow and monstrous in its essence. If Hannibal was so strong in tactics, then Rome needed to create an army against which all tactics would be useless. An army that would win not with intellect, but with brute force. Rome decided to field the largest army ever assembled under the Republic's banners. 8 legions, reinforced by allied contingents. By various estimates, this amounted to between 80 and 90,000 men. This wasn't just an army, it was a living battering ram, a mathematical argument against genius. The idea was simply to crush the Carthaginian formation into the ground, to grind it down with overwhelming numerical superiority. For its time, this was something unimaginable. Such an army, arrayed on a field, represented a colossal wall of humanity and steel, dozens of ranks deep and several miles wide. It was an entire city that had marched to war. The logistics of this monster were a nightmare, command and control practically impossible. But therein lay the audacity of Varro's plan. Command wasn't needed. Only one thing was required: to advance and kill until the enemy was gone. This was the quintessence of the Roman spirit of virtus, pushed to its absolute limit, to an absurd, blind faith in its own power. The reaction in Rome itself was like a seismic rift. The plebs rejoiced. Finally, a leader had emerged who cast aside the timid caution of the aristocrats and was ready to act. The streets buzzed with patriotic speeches. But in the Senate, a grim premonition hung heavy. The old guard, including Fabius Maximus himself, implored Varro and his colleague, the aristocrat Lucius Aemilius Paulus, to be more cautious. They understood that this unruly behemoth was a perfect target for a cunning hunter like Hannibal. Paulus, who held the second consular seat, embodied these fears. He went to war with a heavy heart, trying to rein in his partner's furious momentum. And Hannibal? When his spies reported that an unprecedented Roman army was moving against him, he wasn't horrified. He smiled. This was the best news in 2 whole years of war. His strategy had worked flawlessly. He had insulted Roman pride long enough. He had eluded them long enough for them to finally abandon reason and gamble on brute force. He had transformed his enemy into a furious, blinded bull. Now all he had to do was choose the right arena for the bullfight and sharpen his deadliest sword. Thus, the decision was made. The two consuls, with the largest army in Roman history, moved south, searching for Hannibal. This set off a ticking time bomb. No one in the Greek or Carthaginian world could believe such suicidal audacity. The Roman Republic, blinded by a thirst for vengeance and an unshakable belief in its own invincibility, was marching straight into a perfectly laid trap. The question wasn't if the bomb would explode, but how devastating the blast would be. To understand what transpired on the field at Cannae, you must forget the word battle. What Hannibal conceived and executed wasn't a battle. It was an act of military engineering of the highest order. His army wasn't merely a formation of soldiers. It was a machine. The central metaphor for understanding this machine is not a snare or a pincer, but a gigantic tactical bow, where the Roman army itself played the role of the arrow drawing the string. Hannibal didn't intend to stop the Roman battering ram. He intended to absorb its energy and redirect it towards self-destruction. Let's look under the hood of this diabolical contraption. The heart of the bow, its most flexible part, was the center of the Carthaginian army. There, Hannibal placed his most unreliable and poorly armed warriors, Gauls and Iberians. He arrayed them not in a straight line, but in a convex crescent pointed towards the Romans. This was a brilliant psychological trick. To Roman commanders, such a formation looked like an invitation, an overt display of weakness. It screamed, "Strike here! Break through me!" This was precisely what Hannibal wanted. He knew the Romans, blinded by faith in their charge, wouldn't be able to resist such a temptation. But at the edges of this flexible center, on the flanks, stood the two unyielding arms of the bow. These were 10,000 of his best soldiers, battle-hardened Libyan infantry, veterans who had crossed the Alps with him, armed with captured Roman armor and swords. Hannibal positioned them slightly to the rear at an angle, so they were almost invisible from the front. Their task was simple and mortally important: to stand their ground to the death, not to retreat an inch. They were the solid ends of the bow that had to withstand all the tension when the center began to bend. And the bowstring of this tactical masterpiece was his cavalry, the finest in the world. Here, Hannibal once again employed an asymmetrical approach. On the left flank, facing the weaker Roman cavalry, he placed his heavy Hispano-Gallic cavalry under the command of his brother Hasdrubal. Their mission, to quickly crush the enemy and swing around to the rear. On the right flank, against the stronger cavalry of the Roman allies, were Magabal's Numidians, light, elusive horsemen. Their task was to engage the enemy, wear them down, and prevent them from striking the infantry's flank until Hasdrubal had done his work. Now, let's observe this machine as it roared to life. Step 1. Hannibal chose the perfect moment for battle, early morning. He arrayed his army so that the volturnous wind, blowing from the east, would carry clouds of dust and sand directly into the faces of the advancing legions. This wasn't luck. It was the first act of blinding his opponent, forcing them to operate almost sight unseen, relying on familiar commands and the sound of horns. Step 2. The Romans, led by Varro, formed their colossal battering ram. They arrayed their legions not wide, but deep, transforming the army into a giant, narrow column, designed for a single, head-on breakthrough. They were, in effect, stepping into a bottleneck of their own making. Step 3. The Roman ram struck. Tens of thousands of legionaries slammed into Hannibal's center. And that's when the brilliant deception began. The Gauls and Iberians didn't flee in panic. Instead, they started to slowly, step by deliberate step, give ground. The crescent, initially bulging towards the Romans, began to bow inward. To the legionaries in the front ranks, this looked like an unequivocal victory. They roared with triumph, pushing forward, drawing the rear ranks deeper into the fray. The Roman army, like a viscous fluid, poured into the widening breach, pressing ever deeper into the heart of the Carthaginian formation. The Romans themselves were pulling back the bow's string. At the crucial moment, just as the Carthaginian center had sagged to its utmost limit and the Roman army was compressed into a dense, unmanageable throng, the trap snapped shut. The Libyan veterans on the flanks, who until then had stood steadfast, pivoted and struck into the exposed sides of the encroaching legions. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having routed the Romans on their flank, swept around the entire battlefield and slammed into the rear of the allied cavalry, assisting the Numidians. Following this, all of the Carthaginian cavalry converged behind the Roman infantry. The encirclement was complete. What had once been an army transformed into a cauldron. Tens of thousands of men, squeezed from all sides, deprived of any room to maneuver, unable to even swing a sword. This was no longer a battle. It was a methodical, cold-blooded slaughter. A living wall of spears and shields became a gigantic meat grinder that devoured itself. The mechanics of this miracle were devilishly simple: to use the enemy's strength against itself, transforming its confidence into a suicidal blindness. We marvel at Hannibal's genius, we dissect tactical diagrams, but we often forget that history isn't solely made by generals. It's forged by the marching feet of the common soldier. Let's pause for a moment and imagine a humble Gallic mercenary at the heart of Hannibal's formation. He stands under the scorching sun as an 80,000-strong avalanche of steel and fury hurtles toward him. His armor, if he even possesses any, is a leather tunic and a simple helmet. His task, laid out by that peculiar one-eyed Carthaginian, seems utterly insane, not merely to hold his ground, but to slowly retreat, maintaining formation and luring the enemy deeper. One false step, one surge of panic, and the entire brilliant edifice would crumble. And yet, he does it. Step by painstaking step, he falls back, feeling the breath of his comrades at his back, trusting not so much the orders as the man who promised them glory and gold. The victory at Cannae isn't just a triumph of tactics, but also a testament to the incredible trust a motley army placed in its leader. But behind the curtains of this drama were other, less celebrated heroes without whom the miracle would never have occurred. One of these was Hannibal, commander of the Numidian cavalry. We usually encounter him only at the end of the story, when he supposedly uttered the famous line to Hannibal, "You know how to win, Hannibal, but not how to use your victory." But his role was far more crucial. The Numidians were the army's eyes and ears. It was Hannibal and his horsemen who, for weeks before the battle, conducted reconnaissance, crafting for Hannibal a meticulously detailed, three-dimensional map of the terrain. They knew every fold of the land, every hidden gully, and crucially, they had meticulously studied the habits of the Roman patrols. The choice of battlefield, where the wind blew into the Romans' faces, was no mere coincidence, but the result of Hannibal's painstaking labor. He wasn't merely a cavalryman, he was the chief of intelligence, and his insights became the bedrock upon which Hannibal constructed his masterpiece. Another unsung figure was Bomilcar, commander of a small Carthaginian fleet. While Hannibal waged war in Italy, Bomilcar fought his own, no less critical war in the shadows. His mission was to ensure an uninterrupted flow of supplies and reinforcements from Carthage and Hispania. Every shipment of grain, every 100 new mercenaries smuggled past Roman blockades to a port in southern Italy was a small victory that enabled Hannibal's army to survive. Without this slender thread of logistics, meticulously maintained by Bomilcar, Hannibal's army would simply have starved to death long before Cannae. He was the invisible quartermaster who fueled the war machine, while its brilliant architect prepared his decisive strike. Now, let's descend to the most mundane level and examine a striking detail that speaks volumes about the two armies. The Roman legionary went into battle after a hearty breakfast. The standard ration included buccellatum, a hard, almost stone-like biscuit softened in water or wine, and a bit of salted pork or cheese. This was heavy, calorie-dense food that provided energy but also induced thirst. Hannibal's soldiers, conversely, often went into battle nearly on an empty stomach. Their rations were lighter: a handful of olives, a few figs, a piece of goat cheese. Why? Hannibal understood that in the Apulian heat, a full soldier tires more quickly, constantly craves water, and becomes less nimble. He gambled on light, hungry, and fierce fighters. On the day of the Battle of Cannae, thousands of Romans, trapped in the cauldron under the scorching sun, suffered not only from their wounds, but also from monstrous thirst, aggravated by their own morning meal. This seemingly minor detail, the difference in diet, also became one of the tiny cogs in the mechanism of total annihilation. Thus, victory was forged not only on the battlefield. It was forged by a mercenary's trust in his commander, by Mahabal's meticulous reconnaissance, and by the inconspicuous work of the logistics officer Bomilcar. And even such a prosaic fact as the contents of a soldier's canteen ultimately played its part. History isn't solely a game of geniuses, but also the sum of countless human efforts, fears, and even habits. The scene after the battle was apocalyptic. The field, which had been flat and green just that morning, transformed into a gigantic bloody mire strewn with the bodies of tens of thousands of Romans. The victory was not merely complete, it was absolute, mathematically perfect. The battering ram of an army, the pride of Rome, ceased to exist. In the Carthaginian camp, euphoria reigned. Generals congratulated Hannibal, demanding one thing: an immediate march on Rome. The Republic's capital was defenseless, its gates practically open. The cavalry commander, Mahabal, intoxicated by victory, uttered words that would echo through the ages. "Send me ahead with the cavalry, and in 5 days you will feast on the Capitoline." This was the logical, the only possible next step. The perfect storm, poised to sweep Rome from the face of the earth, had gathered its full strength. And at that moment, at the peak of his triumph, Hannibal said no. He refused to march on Rome. This decision plunged his comrades into shock. It seemed illogical, cowardly, even insane. This was the very instant when a brilliant plan, executed to perfection, collided with an invisible wall. All military logic screamed for the final mortal blow to be struck. But Hannibal stopped. And this pause, this single night of hesitation or cold calculation after Cannae, became the turning point not only in this war, but in the entire history of the ancient world. What did he see, standing on that blood-soaked field, that his elated generals did not? Here we witness a striking dialectic, how the greatest strength of Hannibal's system became its primary vulnerability. His army was a masterpiece of tactical artistry. It was a light, swift, multinational force, composed of mercenaries, perfectly honed for maneuver warfare in the field. It was a surgeon's scalpel, capable of delivering precise and lethal incisions. But Rome was not an organ to be excised. Rome was a granite monolith. To storm a city with miles of walls, with 1 million inhabitants ready to fight for every single house, required not a scalpel, but a heavy siege hammer. Hannibal didn't possess one. He had neither siege engines nor enough infantry for a long and bloody blockade. His army, ideal for annihilating legions in the field, was utterly unsuited for taking the greatest city in the world. And in Rome, a precisely mirrored process unfolded. The very political system that had spawned disaster, the rivalry of consuls, populism, arrogance, mutated into its opposite in the face of mortal danger. When news of Cannae reached Rome, terror gripped the city, but not chaos. The Senate, that collective mind of the Republic, seized power. All internal squabbles were instantly forgotten. Faced with utter annihilation, the main safeguard of the Roman state activated. The idea of the Republic itself proved more important than the life of any individual citizen, more important than the ambitions of any politician. Instead of seeking scapegoats, the Senate acted. Quintus Fabius Maximus, the very cunctator who had been ridiculed just yesterday, effectively became a dictator and began organizing the defense. 8,000 enslaved people were freed and enlisted into the legions. A total conscription was declared, putting even 17-year-old youths under arms. The apotheosis of this incredible resilience was the meeting with the surviving Consul Varro, the primary culprit of the tragedy. The Senate did not execute him. They did not put him on trial. The senators went out to meet him and publicly thanked him for not despairing in the salvation of the Republic. This was not an act of mercy. It was a powerful political manifesto addressed to the entire world, and first and foremost, to Hannibal. You can kill our soldiers, you can kill our consuls, but you will not kill Rome. We will not surrender. Never. Hannibal, a genius of psychology, understood this signal. He realized that he had won the battle, but the war had just shifted to an entirely different dimension. He couldn't take Rome by storm. And now he understood that he couldn't take it by attrition either. His plan had been to, after a crushing victory, splinter Rome's Italian allies away, destroying the very foundation of its power. But even here, an unpleasant surprise awaited him. Yes, some cities in the south did defect to his side, but the core of the Roman Confederation remained unshaken. The allies, observing Rome's reaction, realized it was far too soon to bury the Republic. And this is where, amidst the jubilation of the victors and the moans of the dying, the central question of this story emerges. Hannibal annihilated the Roman army, but with that same blow, he also destroyed everything that made Rome vulnerable. Its internal squabbles, its overconfidence, its indecisiveness. He burned to ashes all of his enemies' weaknesses, leaving behind only a scorched, concentrated will to survive and to seek vengeance. So, wasn't the greatest victory in history simultaneously its greatest strategic defeat? Why didn't Hannibal march on Rome? This question has tormented historians for 2,000 years. There's a pragmatic explanation, which we've already touched upon. He lacked the siege equipment and resources to assault a megalopolis. But there's another, far deeper and more provocative theory. Some historians, such as Hans Delbruck, believe that Hannibal never intended to wipe Rome off the map. His design was more subtle. He didn't want to destroy Rome, but to dismantle its empire. To shatter the system of alliances that fueled Roman power by detaching its Italian cities, and to force the Senate to sign a humiliating peace treaty that would forever confine Rome within its original borders, restoring Carthage's dominance over the Mediterranean. He waged war not for annihilation, but for the political bankruptcy of his adversary. To grasp this logic, one must view the Second Punic War as it truly was, not merely a clash of civilizations, but the First World War for economic supremacy. The Mediterranean Sea in the 3rd century BCE wasn't just water. It was a gigantic marketplace, a global logistics network through which essential resources flowed. Grain from Sicily, silver from Hispania, tin from Britain. Whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the world economy. And for this control, two corporations, the agrarian militarist Republic of Rome and the mercantile empire of Carthage, clashed to the death. And Cannae was not just a battle, but the most successful corporate takeover bid in this economic war. What's more, Hannibal's entire expedition into Italy was, in essence, the boldest private venture project in history. Its funding came not so much from the Carthaginian state treasury as from the personal resources of his family, the Barcid clan. After the defeat in the First Punic War, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, essentially created his own quasi-state in Hispania, taking control of its wealthiest silver mines. It was with this money, this family fortune, that Hannibal hired his army, built his war machine, and began his campaign. He wasn't just a general. He was the chief executive officer of a private military corporation that had taken on the mission of restoring Carthage's lost position in the global market. And now, the hidden meaning behind his actions after Cannae becomes crystal clear. Instead of marching on Rome, he performed a symbolic act of incredible power. From the bodies of fallen Roman aristocrats, senators, and equestrians, he collected their gold rings, a clear sign of their high status. He filled several sacks with them and sent his brother Mago to Carthage. And there, in the Carthaginian Senate, Mago demonstrably poured these rings onto the floor. The golden shower, clinking on the marble, was louder than any victory dispatch. This was not merely a report of victory, it was a report for the investors. Hannibal was telling his board of directors in Carthage, "Look, my strategy is working. I've annihilated their army. I've broken the spine of their aristocracy. I've proven that Rome is vulnerable. The project is a success. Now I need the next tranche of funding. Give me siege engines, give me fresh legions, and I will finish the job. I will force them to sign a peace treaty on our terms." But the Carthaginian Senate, a viper's nest of internal intrigues and consumed by dread of the Barcid clan's burgeoning power, wavered. They dispatched only a trickle of paltry reinforcements. They utterly failed to grasp that at that pivotal moment, the destiny not just of that war, but of the next 500 years of history, hung in the balance. A monumental opportunity slipped through their fingers, sacrificed on the altar of political myopia and avarice. Battlefield genius, it turned out, was utterly powerless against the entrenched inertia of backroom politicians. And now, having meticulously examined the devilish precision of the tactical trap, the Roman Senate's political myopia, the psychological warfare waged with wind and dust, and even the economic undercurrents driving the entire campaign, the scattered fragments of our understanding finally coalesce into a singular, astonishing tapestry. We've journeyed through every chamber of this ancient citadel, scrutinized every minute detail, yet one paramount question persists. Where, precisely, is the master key that unlocks the core enigma of Cannae? What exactly was the stroke of genius that transmuted a mere defeat into absolute annihilation? The conventional wisdom enshrined in every history textbook, the double envelopment tactic, is undeniably elegant. It beautifully describes what transpired, but falls short of fully explaining how. It paints the Roman commanders as not just arrogant, but astonishingly, irredeemably dim-witted. Is it truly conceivable that not a single one of the dozens of seasoned tribunes and centurions caught in the inferno of that colossal meat grinder failed to realize their flanks were being turned? Did absolutely no one attempt to coordinate a breakthrough to the rear or reorganize the faltering lines? An army numbering 80,000 hardened veterans does not simply transform into a passive herd for slaughter in the blink of an eye. This narrative leaves an unsettling sense of incompleteness, as if a complex equation is conspicuously missing one decisive variable. And this elusive variable, this critical missing fragment of code, today bears a very specific designation. Cannae Burial Site Number 7, that anomalous mass grave unearthed on the very edge of the battlefield. Let us scrutinize this chilling piece of evidence once more. At its core, the remains of high-ranking Roman officers encircled exclusively by the bodies of elite Numidian cavalrymen. And crucially, observe the nature of the Roman wounds. Not frontal gashes from Gallic spears, but rather strikes to the side and back, inflicted by short, swift blades. This was no random chaos of battle. This bore the unmistakable signature of professional assassins. This was a protocol of calculated, targeted elimination. And in that singular moment, a blinding flash of insight strikes us. The entire conventional understanding of the battle is spectacularly upended. Hannibal's true genius wasn't merely in encircling the Roman army. That was but the second act in a much grander drama. His authentic masterpiece, his primary unseen strike, was delivered far earlier. While the legions, blinded by stinging dust and battle fury, crashed headlong into the yielding Gallic center, their attention riveted on the illusion of a swift, easy victory. A small, elite detachment of Hannibal's Numidians, like spectral phantoms, silently infiltrated through the maelstrom. Their objective was not the army's rear. Their objective was its very brain. Exploiting the pandemonium, they surged toward the standards, toward the command post, and began methodically one by one to carve through centurions, tribunes, and legates. So, what then is the ultimate key to unlocking the Cannae phenomenon? Hannibal, for the first time in recorded history, grasped that an army wasn't merely a vast collection of bodies. It was, in fact, a singular, interconnected organism, governed by an intricate nervous system of commands. And instead of attempting to hack this gargantuan titan's body into pieces, he delivered a single, precise, surgical strike directly to its spinal cord. He didn't just encircle the Roman army. He first, and far more devastatingly, decapitated it. He transformed the most disciplined military machine the world had ever known into a gigantic, headless body, convulsively thrashing in its death throes, into a panicked mob where no one issued commands and no one heard them. And now, every thread of our exhaustive investigation converges to a single, illuminating point. His profound understanding of Roman psychology, coupled with his keen insight into Varro's boundless ambitions, enabled him to predict with chilling accuracy that they would lunge headlong into his trap. His mastery of meteorology and astute selection of the battlefield provided him with the perfect cover for his audacious special operation, a suffocating veil of dust. The engineered, bow-shaped formation of his forces generated precisely the kind of disorienting chaos in the center that his elite commandos required. And the unwavering trust of his soldiers empowered him to wield them as the most exquisitely precise instrument for executing this monstrous design. So, what then is Cannae? It isn't merely a battle. It stands as history's inaugural multi-layered hybrid war. Hannibal attacked his adversary simultaneously on every conceivable level. Physically, with his infantry and cavalry. Psychologically, with the wind, the dust, and a deceptive retreat. Politically, by expertly playing on the Consul's ambitions. And, most critically, neurologically, by dismantling the enemy's command chain. He wasn't simply fighting legions, he was hacking into the very operating system of the Roman army. And when you view it from such a lofty vantage point, the sheer scale of the design transcends mere military strategy. It borders on the philosophical. Hannibal demonstrated a fundamental truth. Any complex system, be it an army, a corporation, or an entire civilization, possesses critical nodes, its very command centers. A precise strike against such a node triggers a cascading collapse of the entire system. What unfolded afterward, the infamous cauldron, the slaughter, the mountains of corpses, was no longer a battle, but merely a consequence. The inertia of a physical world struggling to process the fact that its primary player had been knocked out of the game long before the final whistle. It seemed after Cannae that history was destined to follow one obvious trajectory. Rome would fall and Carthage would become the master of the world. Yet, the domino effect unleashed by this battle proved utterly unpredictable. The dominoes indeed tumbled, but in an entirely opposite direction. The first tile to fall awry was the Roman military system itself. Reeling from the shock, the Romans, with cold fury, meticulously analyzed their defeat and grasped a crucial insight. Their antiquated army model, managed by annually rotating politician consuls, was a surefire recipe for disaster. Cannae compelled them to embrace an idea previously unthinkable for the Republic, the concept of a unified, stable, and professional command structure. This paradigm-shifting idea found its embodiment in a man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, later renowned as Africanus. Scipio became Hannibal's greatest and most formidable pupil. He didn't just study the Carthaginians' tactics, he absorbed them, dissected them to their atomic level, and reassembled them, but in a distinctly Roman fashion. The Battle of Zama, where Scipio decisively defeated Hannibal, stands as a mirror image of Cannae, where the student surpassed his teacher, wielding the very weapons his mentor had forged. But this was merely the beginning. Cannae ignited an irreversible process of military professionalization that, a century and a half later, after the reforms of Gaius Marius and the dictatorship of Sulla, would usher in Julius Caesar. And this new army, born from the ashes of Cannae, would no longer be the army of the Republic. It would be an army fiercely loyal to its commander, the very instrument that would ultimately dismantle the Republic, transforming it into an empire. Thus, in attempting to save itself from an external foe, Rome unwittingly spawned its own internal gravedigger. But Cannae's legacy endures far beyond history textbooks. It's intricately woven into the very fabric of our culture. The word Cannae itself has transcended a mere geographical designation. It has become a diagnosis. In every military academy worldwide, from West Point to Saint Cyr, the word Cannae is synonymous with the perfect encirclement battle, a tactical masterpiece that strategists aspire to achieve and simultaneously fear. It's a universal code, instantly understood by any military mind on the planet. We harness Cannae's legacy without even realizing it. Hannibal's famous retort, "You know how to win, Hannibal, but you do not know how to profit from victory," has become a timeless maxim. It encapsulates the eternal predicament, the disconnect between tactical triumph and strategic failure. We witness it in business, when a brilliant startup struggles to scale into a major corporation. We see it in politics, when a revolution succeeds but then flounders, unsure of how to wield its newfound power. The very image of Hannibal has become an archetype, the solitary genius who dared to challenge a soulless, overwhelmingly powerful system. This narrative echoes through thousands of books and films, its roots firmly embedded in the dust and blood of that Apulian field. And here we arrive at the central, most magnificent paradox of Cannae's legacy. Initially, it was a triumph of flexibility over brute force, of intellect over sheer mass, of a multinational mercenary army over a monolithic citizen soldier force. Hannibal delivered a brutal lesson to Rome. And Rome, unlike many empires, learned that lesson. It learned it too well. The Roman military machine that emerged after Cannae became a potent synthesis of Roman discipline and Carthaginian cunning. It assimilated the best attributes of its enemy and amplified them with its seemingly inexhaustible human resources. Ultimately, it was the losing side that became the primary beneficiary of this monumental battle. Hannibal intended to weaken and humiliate Rome, but instead, he subjected it to the most expensive and most effective shock therapy in history. He burned away all the arrogance and complacency from the Roman character, leaving behind only tempered steel. His greatest victory, intended to save Carthage, became the direct cause of its future downfall. Hannibal, in trying to prune the branches of the Roman tree, only forced it to send roots so deep that it eventually drained all the life from the Mediterranean soil, leaving no room for others to flourish. The story of Cannae might seem like something infinitely distant, a frozen diorama of bronze and blood. But if we adjust our lens and view this drama through the prism of our own time, it becomes disturbingly relevant. The Roman Republic in 216 BCE isn't merely an ancient state. It embodies the model of any dominant, self-assured system. It's a superpower convinced of the invincibility of its military doctrine. It's a colossal corporation persuaded that its market share is unassailable. And Hannibal isn't just a general. He represents an asymmetric challenge. He's the audacious startup that discovers a vulnerability in the monopolist's code. He's the virus that attacks not the armor, but the operating system itself. What Hannibal accomplished with wind and dust today is executed through torrents of information. His tactics of blinding and disorientation are the precursor to modern hybrid warfare. He created such a profound level of chaos and informational noise on the battlefield that the Roman command chain became utterly paralyzed. Commanders couldn't discern what was happening, soldiers couldn't hear orders, and the entire gargantuan, perfectly tuned machine devolved into an ungovernable biomass. Don't we witness the very same phenomenon today, as fake news, propaganda, and cyber attacks aim not at destroying tanks, but at paralyzing public consciousness and the capacity for decision-making? Cannae serves as an eternal reminder that the most effective way to defeat a powerful enemy is to strip them of their ability to see clearly and think rationally. And it is here that the primary lesson of Cannae for the 21st century crystallizes, and it is far from trivial. This story isn't about simply being smarter or craftier. It's about the very nature of vulnerability. Roman power was concentrated in its legions, in its physical might. And Rome lost because it focused on building muscle, utterly neglecting its nervous system, its lines of communication, its reaction speed, its command flexibility. The system was undone by its own complexity and centralization. One precise strike at the command center, and all that colossal power turned to dust. Today, we construct incredibly intricate systems, global financial markets, energy grids, digital platforms. And like the Romans, we are obsessed with the idea of their power and efficiency. But Cannae poses an uncomfortable question. How resilient are they truly? How robust is our nervous system? What would transpire if one precise surgical strike were aimed not at our armies, but at our communications, at our trust in institutions, at our capacity for collective action? It turns out the true measure of strength isn't the size of the muscles, but the robustness and flexibility of the connections within the system. But there is also a second, brighter side to this lesson. Rome lost the battle, but it survived. Why? Because when its nervous system was obliterated, its immune system kicked in, a deep, almost irrational will to live, ingrained in the very fabric of the Republic. The Senate, the people, the allies, they all rallied in the face of annihilation. This means that the most reliable defense against a Cannae-like scenario isn't merely technological resilience, but also the presence of fundamental values, a shared purpose capable of uniting society even when all formal structures of governance have crumbled. And perhaps herein lies the ultimate takeaway. The Battle of Cannae is an eternal thriller about the clash of two distinct forms of power, hierarchical, armored might versus agile, networked genius. And this battle never truly ends. It's unfolding right now before our very eyes, in business, in politics, and across the information landscape. And its cardinal lesson is that the most critical battlefield in the 21st century isn't located on the ground. It resides in the space between our ears, where decisions are forged, where fear grapples with reason, and where a single, ingenious concept can prove more potent than all the legions of the world combined. For us, Hannibal is an unrivaled genius, a tactical virtuoso. But let's pause for a moment, cross to the other side of that ancient hill, and view this war through the eyes of a Roman senator. Suddenly, the entire landscape shifts dramatically. For Rome, this wasn't merely a struggle for territory, it was a titanic clash of order against chaos. The Roman Republic, for all its colossal pride and internal bickering, saw itself as the very standard-bearer of civilization. It engineered grand roads, codified intricate laws, and forged unambiguous treaties. Its world was a meticulously constructed edifice of rules and enduring traditions, known as the Maiorum. Hannibal, however, was in Rome's estimation the living embodiment of perfidy. He had shattered a sacred treaty by assaulting Saguntum, a staunch Roman ally. He had brazenly invaded Italy without a formal declaration of war. To them, he wasn't a general. He was a lawless bandit, a saboteur of the divine order of things, the Pax Deorum, or peace with the gods. The Romans marched to war not just to vanquish a foe, but to mete out justice to a transgressor and re-establish the cosmic equilibrium. Now just imagine the sheer cultural shock that ripped through an ordinary Roman legionary upon his first glimpse of Hannibal's army. It was utterly unlike anything he had ever encountered. Instead of the familiar disciplined ranks of uniformly armored legions, he saw a chaotic, shrieking multitude. There were half-naked Gauls, their bodies painted with savage designs, brandishing colossal swords. Dark-skinned Numidians, mounted on their tough, diminutive horses, rode them bridleless with astonishing skill, appearing almost as centaurs themselves. Balearic slingers, looking like hardened buccaneers, added to the exotic mix. And presiding over this entire spectacle was the cold, ruthlessly calculating genius of the Carthaginian aristocrat, whispered to have sacrificed children to his grim deities. For a Roman, whose meticulously ordered, disciplined, and citizen-based army was a direct mirror of his society, Hannibal's forces were nothing short of a monstrous assembly, a ravenous horde, scoured from the ends of the earth and held together by nothing more than the cold gleam of gold and the iron grip of fear. What we now laud as brilliant strategy, the Romans denounced as Punic perfidy, a phrase that for centuries became an enduring byword for betrayal. The Romans had a deeply ingrained expectation of honorable combat. Meet on an open field, form disciplined ranks, and settle the score in a straightforward clash of arms. Hannibal, in stark contrast, deployed ambushes, like the devastating one at Lake Trasimene, cunning feints, and psychological warfare. He simply refused to fight by the established rules of engagement. In Rome's estimation, he was no honorable warrior. He was a back-alley assassin, striking from the shadows. Their visceral contempt for his methods was as profound as their terror of his army. When they marched into the fateful engagement at Cannae, it wasn't merely with an unwavering belief in their own might, it was with a searing moral outrage. They were determined to chastise a barbarian who had dared to openly defy the civilized world. And therein lay the profound tragedy of Roman predictability. Their entire formidable power was built upon an unyielding foundation of tradition, order, and meticulously refined doctrines of warfare. The Roman war machine was a flawlessly calibrated mechanism, engineered to systematically crush any adversary who dared to play by its established rules. They were akin to a chess grandmaster who knew every classical opening and countermove by heart. Yet Hannibal sat down at the board and began to play a game no one had ever conceived. He wasn't playing chess. He was engaged in a three-dimensional contest where the board included not just the pieces, but also the whims of weather, the intricacies of psychology, and the very contours of the landscape. The Roman system was simply incapable of processing such an unprecedented level of unpredictability. Their greatest strengths, unwavering discipline and steadfast adherence to tradition, perversely became their gravest liabilities. They were so utterly convinced of the infallibility of their approach that they could not even begin to entertain the notion that their own relentless forward momentum could be twisted into a weapon in the hands of their foe. Time and again, they attempted to solve a novel, utterly unconventional challenge using the same old, proven methods. Their crushing defeat at Cannae wasn't the downfall of the weak. It was the heartbreaking tragedy of the too strong, the too righteous, the too utterly predictable. They were annihilated not because their system faltered, but precisely because it functioned exactly as their brilliant yet utterly merciless enemy had anticipated. We often gaze upon Hannibal as a demigod, a genius whose decisions were flawless and whose strategies were impeccably conceived. But behind every move on that grand chessboard stood a living, breathing human being, and the toll he paid for his genius was excruciatingly high. To truly grasp this cost, we must look at what transpired after the devastating victory at Cannae. Hannibal had promised the cities of Italy freedom from the Roman yoke, casting himself as a liberator. But war, that most brutal of teachers, soon showed its true colors. When some of these freed cities refused to supply his army or attempted to cling to neutrality, the idealist in Hannibal withered away, yielding to the stark pragmatist. He was forced to seize by force what was not given freely, to levy crushing tributes on cities, and at times to brutally punish defiance. The dream of a grand alliance of free peoples shattered against the harsh reality. His army needed to eat, and the only source for sustenance was the very land he was supposedly liberating. Let's try to peer into his inner world. Imagine a man who, at the tender age of 9, swore an oath at the altar before his father, vowing eternal enmity toward Rome. His entire life was thenceforth singularly dedicated to this one all-consuming objective. He knew no other. He stood utterly alone at the pinnacle. His army was a diverse conglomerate of mercenaries, conversing in dozens of tongues, loyal not to Carthage, but solely to him. He could not afford a single moment of weakness, not one misspoken word. Any flicker of doubt in his eyes could ignite a mutiny, unraveling the entire campaign. He was surrounded by people, yet absolutely isolated in his immense responsibility. This crushing burden fundamentally transformed him. The harrowing trek across the snow-capped Alps, where he lost half his army and all but one of his majestic elephants. The grueling march through the treacherous, poisonous marshes of the Arno, where he contracted a virulent infection and lost an eye. This physical loss became a poignant symbol of his internal metamorphosis. For him, the world forever lost its depth, becoming flatter, more acutely focused, and undeniably more brutal. He ceased to be merely a brilliant aristocrat leading a war. He became a one-eyed wolf, trapped in enemy territory, compelled to justify his very existence each day through cunning and raw violence. The dazzling strategist slowly yielded to an exhausted, embittered master of survival. And on the altar of this survival, not only cities but also human beings were sacrificed. The most striking, yet quietly tragic casualty of Hannibal's genius was his most brilliant comrade, his cavalry commander, Hannibal. It was Hannibal who was the architect of the Cannae victory. It was Hannibal who implored Hannibal to march directly on Rome. Hannibal was the very embodiment of swift, devastating warfare, a lightning strike. He was Hannibal's sword. But after Cannae, when Hannibal opted for a protracted, grinding war of attrition, a war of diplomacy and sieges, such a keen-edged sword became superfluous. Hannibal, a genius of the cavalry raid, found himself rendered obsolete in this new reality. His audacious ideas no longer fit the cautious strategy of his commander-in-chief. We don't know precisely what transpired, but after their famous disagreement, Hannibal all but vanished from the pages of history. Hannibal did not execute him. He did not betray him. He did something arguably worse. He allowed him to fade into the shadows. His most talented general, a man who could have won countless battles for him, was sacrificed to a new, pragmatic reality. His renown, his ambition, his talent, all were laid upon the altar of a grand objective that now demanded not brilliance, but unyielding patience. This, then, is the somber underbelly of Hannibal's genius. His intellect was so formidable and all-encompassing that in his grand schemes, people, even his closest confidants, became mere pieces on a board. He was prepared to sacrifice anyone and anything for the ultimate goal. He sacrificed his comfort and his health. He sacrificed his ideals as a liberator, and he sacrificed his best general. And ultimately, this singular, obsessive focus, which made him so great, was also what ultimately undid him, transforming him into a tragic figure, a genius who won every battle but lost the war, remaining in history an isolated, one-eyed titan who never achieved his primary objective. When Hannibal entered Capua, Italy's second-largest city after Cannae, it wasn't a harmonious cultural blend. It was a cataclysmic collision of tectonic plates. Picture an orderly city, long accustomed to Roman discipline, suddenly inundated by an army resembling a colossal, itinerant circus. Not a liberator, but a carnival of foreign tongues, exotic scents, and alien deities stormed the city gates. On streets where Latin and the Oscan dialect had echoed for centuries, Guttural Gallic, sharp Iberian, and the clicking sounds of Numidian now reverberated. The Capuan aristocrats, who had thrown open their gates hoping for an equal partnership, were horrified to discover their lavish villas transformed into barracks for people they considered savages. The conflict ran deeper than mere domestic inconveniences. It was rooted in religion. The Italian cities lived within the familiar framework of the Greco-Roman pantheon, with understandable anthropomorphic gods like Jupiter and Mars. Hannibal's army brought with it a starkly different, far more somber and inscrutable faith. They worshipped Baal Hammon, a fearsome lord god, and the goddess Tanit, whose crescent moon symbol could now be seen on soldiers' amulets. Roman propaganda had for decades painted Carthaginian religion in the darkest possible hues, spreading chilling tales of child sacrifice. And while Hannibal, a shrewd politician, publicly offered sacrifices in local temples, the underlying fear and alienation persisted. Capuans viewed their new allies not merely as foreigners, but as carriers of a dark, dangerous power. And yet, in this boiling cauldron of mutual distrust, astonishing hybrids began to emerge. First and foremost, military ones. Young aristocrats from Campania and Samnium, who had for centuries fought within Roman legions, now found themselves in Hannibal's training camps. They watched with amazement as Numidians attacked and retreated like a pack of wolves, as Iberians wielded their short falcata swords with astonishing virtuosity. They began to adopt these tactics, forging mixed units where Italian resilience merged with Numidian cunning. This wasn't a deep cultural fusion. It was a forced mutation, born of war, the genesis of a new kind of warrior, combining the DNA of two warring worlds. But perhaps the most curious hybrid this era spawned was its coinage. Cities in southern Italy that had defected to Hannibal began minting their own currency to sever economic ties with Rome. These coins became genuine artifacts of cultural collision. On one side, a familiar Greek hero like Hercules or the head of a local nymph might be depicted. But then, on the reverse, entirely alien symbols suddenly appeared: a Carthaginian war elephant or a Phoenician palm tree. These were centaur coins, awkward attempts to fuse their local identity with a new political reality. Each such coin represents a tiny drama, a history frozen in metal, telling the tale of an entire city trying to find its footing between the hammer of Rome and the anvil of Carthage. How did life change for the common person, say, a potter in Tarentum? Radically. Previously, his world was stable. He crafted amphorae for Roman merchants, paid taxes to the Roman quaestor, and prayed to familiar gods. Now, his workshop stands next to a billet where Gallic mercenaries reside. He's forced to learn a few Punic words to haggle over prices with a Carthaginian quartermaster who orders pottery for the army. He sees unprecedented goods in the marketplace brought from Africa. He hears tales from soldiers about distant lands and strange customs. His world expanded, but simultaneously became incredibly fragile and perilous. Old habits died a painful death, the habits of law, of predictability. Before, any dispute would be settled by a Roman praetor. Now, it was decided by the Carthaginian garrison commander, operating by his own utterly opaque rules. The habit of security. Previously, Roman legions guaranteed protection from pirates and brigands. Now, those very legions became the primary threat, and yesterday's enemies, dubious protectors. The very notions of us and them blurred beyond recognition. The neighbor with whom you'd shared wine yesterday might turn out to be a secret Roman sympathizer, while the stern Libyan veteran billeted in your home might save your child from marauders. Ultimately, this melting pot never forged a new, stable alloy. It was a temporary, wartime amalgam, sustained solely by the genius and will of one man, Hannibal. The moment his luck turned and the Roman eagles returned to the south, this fragile hybrid culture was seared away with a red-hot iron. Rome would not forgive treason. Capua was razed to the ground, its inhabitants sold into slavery. The lesson was brutally clear. No hybrids. There was only one path, one law, one culture, the Roman one. The grand experiment to create an alternative Italy, free from Roman dominance, ended in bloody failure, leaving behind only a handful of strange coins and the bitter memory that the clash of civilizations rarely gives birth to beautiful offspring. More often, it ends in tragedy. We tend to think of the Second Punic War as a tale of legions on the march and thundering cavalry charges. But what we often overlook is that simultaneously another, equally fierce war was being waged. A war of narratives, history's first global information campaign. And in this arena, Hannibal was just as much a genius as he was on the battlefield. He wasn't simply leading an army, he was meticulously constructing his own myth. The primary tool of this myth-making was the story of his oath. The account of how his father compelled him, a 9-year-old boy, to swear eternal hatred for Rome at an altar wasn't just a family anecdote, it was a brilliant public relations coup. This narrative transformed Hannibal from a mere invader into an instrument of divine retribution, a man with a mission. For his motley army of mercenaries, it served as powerful ideological fuel. They weren't fighting for Carthage, they were fighting for a man touched by destiny. Upon invading Italy, Hannibal continued this information war. His core message was simple and seductive. I come not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. After each battle, he would release captured Italian allies of Rome without ransom, telling them that he was fighting not against the peoples of Italy, but against their common tyrant, Rome. He positioned himself as a freedom fighter against an empire. This was a calculated strategy designed to shatter the Roman Confederation from within. He promised not just victory, he promised a new, just world order where every people would be free. He was crafting an alternative reality, and for many oppressed Italian tribes, it appeared incredibly appealing. Rome, recognizing the danger, responded with a powerful counter-propaganda effort. If they couldn't defeat Hannibal on the battlefield, they resolved to destroy his reputation. The primary weapon of Roman historians and orators became the concept of perfidia punica, Punic treachery. Any tactical maneuver by Hannibal, any clever ruse, was declared not an act of intelligence, but proof of his perfidious and base nature. An ambush at Lake Trasimene? Treachery. A feigned retreat at Cannae? Treachery. They created the image of an enemy incapable of fighting fair, one who always struck from behind. This myth proved incredibly resilient. Even today, some languages retain expressions linking Punic loyalty with betrayal. But the smear campaign didn't stop there. Roman propagandists played their ultimate trump card: religion. They actively spread rumors, resurrecting old fears that the Carthaginians were cruel barbarians who sacrificed their own children to the gods. Hannibal transformed from a treacherous enemy into a fiend from hell, a servant of bloody cults. The objective was simple: dehumanize the enemy. You can't negotiate with a monster, you can only destroy it. This propaganda worked flawlessly. It transformed a war for dominance into a holy war of civilization against barbarism, rallying even those allies around Rome who had begun to waver. And this brings us to the core principle of information warfare. History is written by the victors. Let's take that very oath of Hannibal's. For Roman historians like Livy, it became irrefutable proof of the irrational, innate hatred of Carthaginians for Rome. It served as justification for all of Rome's subsequent actions, including the complete annihilation of Carthage. It was a convenient and simple version. But what if things were different? What if this story was crafted by Hannibal himself or his inner circle as part of his heroic myth? In this version, the oath isn't the cause of the war, but its ideological banner, a tool for mobilizing the masses. It turns out that the same event, filtered through two propaganda machines, transforms into its complete opposite. For some, it's a symbol of a sacred mission. For others, it's the brand of original sin. So, the image of Hannibal that has come down to us is a curious hybrid, forged on the battlefields of information warfare. It bears both the traits he himself inscribed into his legend and the scars left by the pens of his enemies. The Battle of Cannae ended in a single day, but the battle for its interpretation, for the image of its main protagonist, continues to this very moment. And this, perhaps, is the longest echo of that war. The invisible ink of propaganda proved more durable than the blood spilled on the battlefield. The euphoria after Cannae quickly gave way to the harsh, grueling prose of war. Hannibal, confined to southern Italy, confronted a brutal reality. His army was an insatiable beast that demanded food, fodder, and funds. And the only source for these resources was the land of his new Italian allies. And it was here, in the fields and towns of Campania and Apulia, that a second, far deeper and more fatal turning point occurred. The original intent, the grand idea of liberating Italy, began to irreversibly warp. The goal, the creation of an alliance of free peoples, gradually receded into the background, and the means to achieve it became total war, which devoured everyone, friend and foe alike. This turning point spawned a deep internal rift, not among the Carthaginian generals, but between Hannibal and his new allies. Picture a noble aristocrat from Capua who, risking everything, opened the gates to Hannibal, genuinely believing in his promises. He saw the Carthaginian not as a conqueror, but as a partner who would help throw off the Roman yoke and restore his city to its former glory. He was an idealist who had bought into a beautiful myth. But what had Hannibal become? A pragmatist to the core. He saw Capua not as a partner, but as his primary winter quarters, a supply depot, and a staging ground for future operations. Conflict was inevitable. The Capuan idealist watched as the fields of his homeland were trampled by foreign armies, as his fellow citizens groaned under the burden of military requisitions. He saw that instead of the promised freedom, he had gained a new, even more demanding master. Hannibal, for his part, viewed the complaints of his allies as betrayal and ingratitude. He was shedding blood for their freedom, and they weren't willing to give him their last sack of grain. Dialogue between them became impossible. One spoke the language of ideals and old grievances, the other the language of military necessity. The dream of an alliance of equals shattered against the harsh reality of a soldier's mess kit. A symbolic act which marked the ultimate betrayal of the idea was the fate of the small Campanian city of Nuceria. The city remained loyal to Rome, and Hannibal besieged it. When the defenders realized they were doomed, they surrendered on the condition that they be allowed to leave, taking only what they could carry on their persons. Hannibal agreed. And now, imagine this scene. A column of exhausted, broken people, the elderly, women, children, exiting the gates of their hometown, leaving behind all their possessions, their homes, their entire lives. They look back and see Hannibal's soldiers storming into the deserted city. And a few hours later, a column of black smoke rises above Nuceria. Hannibal had given the order to burn the city to the ground. From a military logic perspective, this was justified. He couldn't leave a fortified position in his rear that the Romans could reoccupy. But from the perspective of his mission as a liberator, it was a catastrophe. That smoke over Nuceria was seen by all the cities of southern Italy, and the signal they read in that smoke was unequivocal. Hannibal was not building a new world, he was merely destroying the old one. He was not a protector, but a force as ruthless as Rome itself. He was willing to sacrifice any of them for the sake of his own war. At that moment, he ceased to be a symbol of hope for the Italians. He became yet another threat. In trying to hold together his crumbling alliance through force and fear, Hannibal, with his own hands, destroyed its very soul. The second point of no return had been crossed. This was no longer a war for Italy. This was Hannibal's war against everyone. When the smoke of the last battle cleared and Hannibal forever departed Italy, Rome celebrated its victory. But it was a feast on bones. The Rome that entered this war and the Rome that emerged from it were two entirely different entities. And the true victors in this conflict were not found on the battlefield at all. The old senatorial aristocracy, whose sons died by the thousands at Cannae, was bled dry. But the primary loser was the ordinary Roman farmer, the very foundation and backbone of the Republic. For 15 years, his fields had been scorched, his cattle stolen, and he himself either perished in the legions or, upon returning, found his farm in ruins and drowning in debt. He could no longer compete. In his place rose a new elite. These were not the ancient patrician families, but the equites, the equestrian class of financiers, merchants, and most crucially, military contractors. For them, the war had become a grand business venture. They grew rich supplying food to the new armies, building fleets, and collecting taxes in reconquered provinces. While the aristocrats bled, these individuals accumulated capital, and they invested this capital in land. For next to nothing, they bought up ruined farms, consolidating them into gigantic estates or latifundia, where hundreds of thousands of new slaves captured during the war toiled instead of free citizens. The old Italy of small farmers was dying. In its place, a new Italy of slave-owning agricultural mega-holdings was being born. Thus, the entire economy was restructured. The colossal resources that flooded into Rome after the victory, tributes from Carthage, silver from Spain, were not distributed evenly. They settled in the pockets of the new financial and political elite. And millions of former farmers, deprived of land and work, poured into Rome, forming a colossal, impoverished, and embittered urban proletariat. Unwittingly, the victory over Hannibal created the very combustible material that, 100 years later, would ignite the Republic from within during the civil wars. Rome defeated Carthage, but in the process, it birthed its most terrible internal enemy, class hatred. But the most profound change occurred not in the economy, but in the collective psyche of the Roman people. 15 years of terror, with the enemy at the gates, left an unhealed wound. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates, became a byword with which mothers, centuries later, would still frighten disobedient children. This fear, metus punicus, became the subconscious driving force of all subsequent Roman policy. It grew paranormally aggressive. Rome would never again allow an enemy to gather strength. Any potential threat had to be crushed in its infancy. It was this fear, born at Cannae, that would lead to the complete and methodical destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War, to the genocide of its population, an act of unprecedented cruelty intended to forever banish the spectre of Hannibal from Roman nightmares. Paradoxically, this trauma also gave rise to an incredible euphoria. Having survived a near-fatal blow, Rome became convinced of its own immortality and divine destiny. If Hannibal couldn't destroy us, then no one can. This idea became the ideological fuel for future global expansion. The Roman worldview radically changed. They ceased to be merely an Italian people. They began to see themselves as masters of the world. Fear made them ruthless, and the awareness of their resilience made them boundlessly ambitious. From the ashes of Cannae, not merely a renewed republic was born, but the future empire, brutal, efficient, and confident in its right to command all peoples. Beyond the clash of battles and the web of political intrigue, there always lies a greater idea. To truly grasp why Rome endured while Hannibal ultimately fell, we must unearth their philosophical blueprints. Rome didn't possess its own grand metaphysics, as the Greeks did. Its philosophy was supremely pragmatic, functioning as the very operating system of the state. And the core tenet of this system was straightforward and unyielding: the absolute supremacy of the Republic. Res publica, the public thing or commonwealth, wasn't merely a form of government for them. It was a sacred entity, a veritable deity, to which every citizen, from the consul to the humblest pauper, was bound to serve with body, soul, and possessions. Personal life, individual happiness, even personal glory held meaning only when they contributed to augmenting Rome's grandeur. It was this very idea, instilled into their consciousness from infancy, that formed the unyielding core, preventing Rome from fracturing after Cannae. Is the army gone? Then the Republic shall birth a new one. The intellectual engine, the very embodiment of this concept, was a man who lived as a palpable ghost of the Cannae trauma. Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder. He was no ivory tower philosopher. He was a farmer, a soldier, a senator, the very essence of old Rome. For him, any compromise was decay, any luxury, treason, any foreign influence, poison. He was the grey eminence of an entire era, its moral tuning fork set to one single insistent note, the security of the Republic above all else. He witnessed the new elite drowning in wealth, saw Greek philosophy eroding ancient traditions, and perceived in this a mortal threat, a relapse into the very complacency that had led to Cannae. Cato's entire philosophy condensed into a single phrase, which, legend has it, he used to conclude every one of his speeches in the Senate, no matter the topic. Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. For him, this wasn't merely a political slogan, it was a philosophical creed. Carthage wasn't just a former foe, it was Rome's eternal, existential antipode. A world of merchants, not warriors. A world of individualists, not citizens. In his eyes, Carthage was a cancerous tumor on the body of the world, and as long as it persisted, the Republic would never be safe. He was ready to sacrifice anything, treaties, honor, mercy, just to excise this threat root and branch. But opposing this harsh, xenophobic doctrine was another idea, no less potent. Its champion was the conqueror of Hannibal, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus. Scipio was a man of the New World. He was a Hellenophile, a connoisseur of Greek culture, language, and philosophy. He didn't see foreign influence as a threat, he saw it as an opportunity. His philosophy wasn't one of a fortress, but of an empire. He believed Rome could not merely conquer, but also assimilate, absorbing the best from other cultures, thereby forging something new and grander. He was the embodiment of openness, individual genius, and aristocratic magnanimity. The dispute between Cato and Scipio wasn't simply a personal rivalry. It was a battle between two visions of the future for the soul of Rome. Cato sought to lock Rome within its old, time-tested traditions, transforming it into an impregnable yet inward-looking fortress. Scipio wanted to fling open Rome's gates to the world, turning it into a melting pot of civilizations. This debate profoundly shaped real-world policy. Scipio, having defeated Carthage, offered relatively lenient peace terms, allowing the city to retain its autonomy and self-governance. Cato, for decades thereafter, demanded its complete annihilation. Ultimately, in this grand ideological struggle, paranoia emerged victorious. Scipio won the war on the battlefield, but Cato won the war in the minds of the Romans. The fear born at Cannae proved more potent than the magnanimity of the victor. 50 years after the war's conclusion, Rome, haunted by the ghost of Cato, provoked the Third Punic War and utterly erased Carthage from the face of the earth, ploughing its land and sowing it with salt. The philosophy of total security, one that brooked no compromises, had triumphed. And this victory definitively charted Rome's course, a path of ruthless expansion where anyone not with Rome was automatically against it. Immediately after the Battle of Zama, where Scipio decisively defeated Hannibal, it might have seemed that the system hadn't died, but merely entered a dormant state. Carthage was still one of the world's wealthiest cities. Its harbors teemed with merchant ships, its markets overflowed with goods. But this was an illusion of life. The great military empire that had defied Rome had been transformed into a gigantic, castrated bull, powerful and rich, yet stripped of its will and its weapons. Rome forbade Carthage from maintaining a navy and an army, and from waging wars without its explicit permission. And in this enforced idleness, a system built for expansion and conflict began to devour itself. There was no external enemy. Thus, the primary battleground became Carthage's own political system, where old factions, the landowning aristocrats and the merchant party, clashed in a deadly petty squabble for the remnants of power and wealth. Upon his return home, Hannibal, the greatest of Carthaginians, tried to be a physician to this ailing system. Elected to the highest civil office of suffect, he waged war on the primary internal enemy, corruption, with the same energy he once used to plan battles. He uncovered that oligarchs had been plundering the treasury for decades and implemented reforms that made the government accountable to the people. He sought to breathe new life into a dying organism, redirecting its energy from warfare to domestic reconstruction. But the system rejected him like a foreign implant. The oligarchs, whose coffers he had emptied, saw him as a mortal threat. And they did what systems protecting their status quo always do. They reported their hero to the enemy. They informed Rome that Hannibal was secretly preparing for a new war. The system chose betrayal over reform. This betrayal marked the beginning of the end. Hannibal had to flee to avoid being handed over to the Romans. And after his exile, the struggle for the legacy of his ideas flared up with renewed intensity. This was a battle between two Carthages. One, the hypothetical Carthage of merchants, cried out, "Let's forget about wars. Let's be obedient allies of Rome, grow rich and prosper under its protection." They gutted Hannibal's idea of a strong state, stripping it of all militaristic elements and leaving only the concept of prosperity. The other, the Carthage of patriots, whispered in the streets, "This is a lull. We must secretly gather strength, bide our time. Hannibal will return." They transformed his legacy into a dangerous underground cult of revenge. These two factions tore the city apart, paralyzing its will and making it easy prey for Roman machinations. And Rome did not delay. Half a century later, driven by Cato's paranoia, it presented Carthage with an ultimatum that was not a demand, but a thinly veiled death sentence. The Romans demanded that the Carthaginians abandon their native city and relocate inland, far from the sea. For a people of seafarers, merchants, and shipbuilders, this was tantamount to demanding collective suicide. It meant renouncing not just their city, but their very soul, everything that made them Carthaginian. And at this moment, on the precipice, all internal squabbles ceased. In besieged Carthage, the last, most desperate fragment of Hannibal's spirit awakened. The entire city transformed into a single military camp. Merchants became soldiers, aristocrats became commanders. Temples were converted into armories. Gold and silver tableware were melted down into coins to pay wages. Women cut their long hair to weave ropes for catapults. This was the final, heroic, and utterly hopeless surge of a will to live. This was no longer the Carthage of oligarchs. This was a warrior city, the last bearer of that very idea of total resistance bequeathed to them by their greatest hero. This agony lasted for 3 years. For 3 years, a city stripped of its army and navy repelled the attacks of the best Roman legions. But the end was predetermined. The Romans breached the city, and a massacre began that lasted for 6 days and 6 nights. The streets were piled high with bodies. When it was all over, Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman general and grandson of the victor at Zama, gazed at the smoking ruins of the great city and wept. He did not weep for Carthage. He wept, thinking that a similar fate might one day befall his native Rome. The city was burned to the ground. Its walls were razed, and the land on which it stood was, according to legend, sown with salt, so that nothing would ever grow there again. The great system that spawned Hannibal and once commanded half the world finally died. It was killed not so much by the Roman sword as by its own internal decay, its inability to change, and the betrayal of its greatest hope. The end of an era was marked not merely by the fall of a city, but by its complete erasure from the book of history. All that remained was the ghost of its greatest hero and an eternal lesson about how great systems die, from within, from fear and betrayal. After the Romans sowed salt into the ruins of Carthage, they performed an even more terrible act. They scorched the very earth of its memory. The entire history of the Second Punic War as we know it is a narrative woven by Rome. Carthage's libraries were set ablaze. Its chronicles, its poems, its entire worldview all vanished into ash. For 1,500 years, the sole sources of information about Hannibal were the works of his adversaries, Titus Livy, Polybius, and others. They meticulously crafted an image that became canonical for centuries, that of a cunning, cruel barbarian, undeniably brilliant, but utterly devoid of honor. Medieval Europe, as Rome's inheritor, fully internalized this version. Hannibal morphed into a figure in morality tales, an emblem of hubris ultimately punished by divine power. His tactics were lost to time, his motivations twisted beyond recognition. He lay buried beneath dense layers of Roman propaganda, and it seemed this oblivion would endure indefinitely. But then dawned an era that began to pose different inquiries. The Age of Enlightenment and the revolutionary wars that followed revered genius above piety. Military theorists and subsequently military commanders began to pore over ancient texts anew, though this time through a different lens. Roman morality held no interest for them. Their fascination lay in the blueprint for victory. They scrutinized accounts of the Battle of Cannae, and rather than Punic treachery, they perceived tactical brilliance. Hannibal was resuscitated. He was extricated from the shadows of Roman history and elevated to the pantheon of great military leaders alongside Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. His second birth, a triumphant return to the stage of history, can be pinpointed to the year 1800. A young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, leading his army into Italy, deliberately chose the most arduous route, through the Alpine pass of St. Bernard. This was more than a mere military maneuver. It was a grandiose historical spectacle. Napoleon consciously echoed Hannibal's daring feat, challenging not only his adversaries, but history itself. He became the Carthaginians' foremost devotee, meticulously studying his campaigns, marveling at his audacious spirit and his unparalleled ability to inspire and lead. Thanks to Napoleon, Hannibal transitioned from a semi-mythical villain into an icon for a new generation of ambitious leaders. His legacy was meticulously retrieved from the archives and once again emerged as a vibrant, potent, and indeed dangerous body of knowledge. Yet, as is often the case, new epochs interpreted old ideas in entirely idiosyncratic ways, imbuing them with novel and frequently distorted meanings. The most celebrated and tragic misreading of Hannibal unfolded in the hallowed chambers of the Prussian and subsequently German General Staff. German military theorists, from Clausewitz to Schlieffen, became utterly fixated on the concept of Vernichtungsschlacht, the battle of annihilation. For them, Cannae transformed into a sacred grail, a mathematical formula for achieving the perfect victory. They meticulously dissected this battle, distilling all of Hannibal's genius down to a singular element, the double envelopment tactic. They transmuted a living, breathing art of war, rooted in psychology, cunning, and an intimate understanding of the terrain, into a lifeless, rigid geometric diagram. The infamous Schlieffen Plan, which Germany unleashed in the year 1914, was, at its core, an audacious attempt to replicate Cannae on a continent-wide scale. Their ambition was to encircle and annihilate the French army with one colossal envelopment. But they fatally overlooked that Hannibal triumphed not through a mere blueprint, but through sheer intellect. His victory was predicated on dazzling his adversaries and outmaneuvering them with deception. By attempting to mechanically copy the form, they entirely disregarded the substance. And this profound misreading of Hannibal's genius tragically culminated in the stalemated horrors and bloody carnage of the First World War. Thus, Hannibal's second birth proved no less dramatic than his first life. He transformed into a mirror, reflecting whatever each era wished to perceive. For Napoleon, he symbolized romantic genius. For the German generals, he was the architect of an invincible military machine. For 19th century historians, he was a champion of national freedom against imperial Rome. Every epoch fashioned its own Hannibal, one that was convenient and comprehensible to its unique sensibilities. And beneath these myriad masks, the true man, the Carthaginian aristocrat who waged war not for abstract ideals, but for trade routes, silver mines, and the honor of his family, was almost entirely lost. The greatest general of antiquity was once again interred, but this time beneath the formidable weight of his own resurrected legend. And so, we complete the circle. We began this inquiry with what appeared to be a simple military question. How did Hannibal manage to win at Cannae? But in the end, we've seen how this battle became a bifurcation point, altering everything. We witnessed how an arrogant, yet still flexible republic confronted an asymmetric genius who laid bare all its vulnerabilities. How it nearly perished, yet survived, learned its lesson, and transformed into a ruthless imperial machine that in turn consumed the entire world. History had made a full revolution. Rome, the conqueror of Hannibal, now occupied his very position on the global chessboard. It became that same dominant, yet increasingly unwieldy power. And the ghost of Hannibal, the specter of an asymmetric threat, would haunt it throughout history, manifesting as Parthian horse archers, Germanic tribes in the Teutoburg forest, or internal conspiracies. The problem with which everything began had not vanished. It had simply changed its actors and its scenery, preparing for the next act in the eternal drama. And here we confront the ultimate, insoluble paradox of this entire saga. Hannibal inflicted upon Rome the most terrible blow imaginable. He laid bare its political squabbles, ridiculed its military tactics, and trampled its pride. He did everything he could to obliterate his adversary. Yet instead of destroying Rome, he inadvertently forged it. The very strike meant to slay the Republic only seared away its impurities, its complacency, its naive belief in fair play, transforming it into the ultimate predator forged in the crucible of near annihilation. His relentless drive to break the system by laying bare its flaws didn't lead to its collapse, but to its monstrous, almost inhuman evolution. The crushing irony, then, is that Hannibal's greatest tactical triumph became his most profound strategic defeat. He proved to be Rome's most formidable teacher, the most ruthless and devastatingly effective. With his own hands, he forged the very sword that would ultimately pierce the heart of his homeland. His genius wasn't that of a destroyer of the old world, but rather that of a midwife, assisting in the birth of an even more ruthless new order. This narrative transcends mere history, refusing to remain just a tale from a distant past. It transforms into a universal parable of strength and weakness, of audacious challenge and inevitable response. We witness this cycle unfold time and again, in the cutthroat world of business, where a daring startup challenges a monopoly, only to force it to adapt and emerge even stronger. In the treacherous arena of politics, where a revolution aimed at toppling tyranny instead gives birth to an even more absolute regime. And as we gaze upon the smoking ruins of Carthage, the solitary figure of Hannibal in exile, and the triumphant legions of Rome marching toward global dominion, we are left with a single, ultimate question, one that has no answer, nor ever can. Is genius merely a blind instrument of history? Its true mission not to conquer, but to forge future empires in the fires of its own demise? And is every new daredevil, every audacious challenger to the system, ultimately doomed to merely craft an even more perfect and ruthless monster than the one they fought?